Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle. The show, as most of you know, brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. If you're new to FFF, come to visit us at fff.org, where you've got around 31 years worth of principled, uncompromising perspectives on liberty, and subscribe to our FFF Daily, which we've published, I don't know how many years now, in which we strive to make the best libertarian commentary page on the internet. That's for free. Subscribe to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. Donate to the Future of Freedom Foundation. We'd greatly appreciate your support. And, of course, subscribe to this YouTube channel. So in 1970, Leonard Read, the president of the Foundation for Economic Education in Irvington-on-Hudson, New York, published a chapter in a book that the chapter was called Sinking in a Sea of Butts. And the book was called Talking to Myself. When I read that essay back in the latter part of the 1970s, it had a profound impact on me. Just a powerful, powerful impact. And what Read was saying in this essay is that the freedom movement was sinking in a sea of butts. Now, what he meant by that is the number of freedom advocates, libertarians, who say, well, I favor freedom, but, you see, and then with the but comes the exception. And that when you add up all the buts and all the libertarians that are advocating the buts, the freedom movement is sinking in a sea of butts. And that was back in 1970. So where are we today? Well, today I don't think any libertarian would deny that we have sunk into a sea of butts. I mean, that's what's so fascinating to me, is that if you take like libertarians of my age group, let's say from 60 to 80, I would venture to say that the great majority of them read this essay by Leonard Read. I mean, FEE was the first libertarian foundation. I would say most libertarians from 60 years old to 80 years old were deeply influenced by FEE, and so they were familiar with Leonard Read and Leonard Read's books. And so there's a good possibility that they read this essay, and if not, they know where Read stood in terms of a principled, consistent approach to libertarianism. And yet, many of them continued advocating the buts, which just totally befuddles me, because the essay had such a powerful impact on me that I thought, I don't want to be one of those advocates of butts. I don't want to be a Budinsky. I want to be presenting this principled case, which is what Leonard Read advocated, and that's why he had such a powerful impact on me. In fact, when I went to work for the Foundation for Economic Education back in the 1980s, I wrote an essay that was published in the Foundation's monthly journal, The Freeman, called Leonard Read Changed My Life. And it was essays like this, Sinking in a Sea of Butts, that had such a powerful impact on me. So I want to talk to you about where we are today with respect to these buts and the libertarian movement, with respect to this essay that Read wrote back in 1970. Because I would suggest that while Read was saying the freedom movement back there was sinking in a sea of butts, that unfortunately, ever since, by the time we get to where we are today, the libertarian movement has sunk. It has sunk in a sea of butts. I mean, I talked about the age group from 60 to 80. Many of them are advocates of butts, but also there's the group from 20 to 50s years of age that they have become advocates of butts. And those of us that are opposed to the butts, we are the small minority in this libertarian movement. But if we're going to achieve freedom, and that's really why I think most of us are libertarians, is that freedom is important to us. But if we're going to achieve it, we've got to get rid of these butts. Now, I'm not saying get rid of the people advocating the butts. What I'm saying is that we've got to attract enough people into our movement that believe that Leonard Read was right. that we've got to present this consistent principled case with no buts for liberty. And so let me analyze where we are with many of these buts. I favor freedom, Jacob, but we've got to have Social Security, Jacob. There's no question about it. Yeah, it's a socialist program, and libertarians are opposed to socialism. But, Jacob, if we got rid of Social Security today, why, there'd be people dying in the streets tomorrow. There's just no question. People have become dependent on it. They put their money into the system, and they have a right to get it back. And I favor freedom, Jacob, but we've got to have Social Security. And so that's the big but. I mean, if you did a survey of libertarians, I would say that, many of them, if not most of them, would say, this is one but I agree with, Jacob, that Leonard Read just didn't have it right, this is one but that we've got to have it. And some of them say, well, we've got to do it gradually, Jacob. We've got to do it gradually, get rid of this system, which is essentially advocating doing something contrary to libertarian principles for a certain period of time. And Read points this out in his essay. He actually addresses the gradualists back in 1970. Now, this debate's been going on a long time, where you've got the advocates of the buts saying, well, but Jacob, I want to just get rid of these programs gradually. And as Read pointed out in this essay, oh, and by the way, if you want to read the essay, you can come to the Future of Freedom Foundation's website, type in Sinking in the Sea of Butts, and it'll pop up. It's an article by Leonard Read that we've reposted on our website, or you can go to fee.org and put it in their search engine. But Read addresses this point about gradualism, and he says, all you're doing is extending out the wrongdoing, and it really becomes perpetual. That gradually reducing something with the quest of ending it means you're never going to end it. And that what you really need to do, you've got to stand for ending it immediately and make the case for ending it. Now, he points out that as a practical matter, that's not going to happen. We all know that things take time for people to digest it and then get it to a point where it's going to be repealed. But that's not the point. The point is that you got to stand for it in order that people start understanding the case for it, and that by the time that enough people understand the case and agree with it because they want to be free and they want to get rid of this big but, then people are ready for it to be repealed. And also, notice that what Read didn't point out, though, but what I think is an important point to point out, is that you got to have faith in freedom. I mean, you've got to believe that freedom works. And I've heard libertarians say that, oh, Jacob, I believe freedom works, but, and then there comes the but, that you couldn't count on enough people to take care of the elderly who truly need it. I mean, there's a lot of elderly that don't need the money. It's an extra little perk, pay the, fees at the golf course or something. And they don't really need it. Some might have to go back to work. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I'm still working. It's fine. And I love my work. So there's nothing wrong with working into your latter years, and it keeps you involved in the mainstream of life. But there's people that truly need it. I mean, if somebody's out there and 75 years old in the cancer ward and doesn't have a family, but that's where voluntary charity comes in. I mean, that's where we've got to restore this faith, and the only people that can do that are libertarians. I mean, I have no doubts that if Social Security were abolished today, everything would be fine tomorrow. Everything would be absolutely fine. God has created resilient human beings that are able to respond. And remember, Americans live without this socialist program for, 150 years? I mean, they proved that it could be done. Now, whenever I bring this up about the 19th century and what they accomplished, my reform-oriented friends in the libertarian movement get all upset, and they say, oh, Jacob, you're just trying to prove that the 19th century was a libertarian panacea. No, I'm not. I'm trying to simply say that they were able to accomplish a society, as imperfect as it was, and we know it was imperfect with slavery and other violations of liberty, but they were able to accomplish a society with no Social Security, no income tax, welfare, IRS, DEA, Medicare, Medicaid, Centers for Disease Control, Pentagon, CIA, immigration controls, I mean, on and on and on. They proved that it can be done. So the idea that, oh, this is utopian, which we often hear from our reform-oriented friends of the libertarian movement, that is those that advocate the buts, that this is utopia and impossible, is ridiculous, because 19th century Americans prove that it can be achieved. It may be difficult, but it's not impossible. Now here's another but. I favor freedom, Jacob, but we've got to have Medicare and Medicaid, Jacob. I mean, there's just no question about it. That if we got rid of Medicare and Medicaid, think of all the people that'd be dying in the streets from illness and disease. And oh no, Jacob, you're not familiar with the soaring cost of healthcare, obviously. That this is one area where we've just got to keep continuing. But I believe in freedom, Jacob, and free markets. Well, you see, and there you are, another great big but. And these are two huge buts, and they're actually advocated by many people in the libertarian movement, especially people in my age group, that they've embraced these buts, and that they're just not going to let them go, regardless of what Leonard Reeves said back in 1970, regardless of what anyone will say today, that they're committed. And then a related aspect of this healthcare debate is the Centers for Disease Control and the FDA. I mean, there's a lot of anger and outrage among libertarians that, oh, they've got the lockdowns, Jacob, and they've got the passports, the vaccine passports coming on, and they've got mask mandates, and they're just not managing the system right, Jacob. They ought to put a libertarian in charge of managing this system. But we got to keep the system, Jacob. I mean, I favor freedom, but we've got to have the Centers for Disease Control. We've got to have the FDA. And we've got to have Medicare and Medicaid. We've got to have government involvement in healthcare, Jacob. But I believe in freedom and free markets, you see. And so there's another great big but, and those are two huge buts. The Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and healthcare and so forth. Another big one is immigration. You see this often in the libertarian movement. Jacob, I favor freedom. I mean, I'm a big advocate of free markets and free enterprise, but we've got to have immigration controls, Jacob. There's just no question. We can't have the whole world coming over here and getting on welfare, Jacob. They'll go into our public schools, and they'll bring crime, and they'll bring all sorts of things. So I believe in freedom, Jacob. But no, we got to have this socialist system of immigration controls, and it is a socialist system. It's just as socialist as Medicare and Medicaid and Centers for Disease Control and Social Security. These are all socialist programs. This one involves central planning, like the Centers for Disease Control does with respect to health care. And of course, the system's been in crisis and chaos, since the 1950s or so? It's perpetual. And that shouldn't surprise anyone. That's what socialism does. It produces crises. It produces chaos. Ludwig von Mises called it planned chaos. I mean, what a great term to describe the immigration crisis. It's ongoing. It's perpetual. You hear the standard cries, oh, we need comprehensive immigration reform. What does that even mean? But regardless of what it means, if it were adopted, it wouldn't matter. You'd still have a crisis, because that's what central planning does. And not only do you get a crisis, but you get the police state that comes with immigration controls. So here you have the irony of libertarians advocating a police state, but justifying it as a but. I favor freedom, Jacob, but we've got to have immigration controls. There's just no question we can't have freedom there. All right, so then we've got education, okay, another big one. Jacob, I favor freedom, but we've got to have school vouchers. I mean, and we've got to continue public schooling. We're going to abolish public schooling, Jacob? Think how many dumb people we'd have in society. They wouldn't learn how to read or write or speak English. No, Jacob, you've gone too far now. I favor freedom, but we've got to have the public schooling system. But we should have a voucher system, which is another socialist system, because that's what public, i.e. government schooling is. It's a socialist system too. It's based on central planning and mandatory attendance laws and school taxes. I mean, just think, if you got to force people to participate in a program and force people to fund it, that's a pretty good sign that something's wrong with the system. But there it is. There's the but. I favor freedom, but Jacob, we've got to have it here. I mean, what if parents just forget to educate their children? I mean, that would be a disaster, Jacob. We could end up with all these dumb people all throughout society. And so there's this lack of faith in freedom. And then the reformers libertarian reformers, they advocate vouchers, and in the beginning, they advocated vouchers as a way to end public schooling. That was what Milton Friedman said. He's sort of the grandfather of the voucher movement, a Nobel Prize-winning libertarian economist. I wrote an essay, our very first year of publication at the Future of Freedom Foundation. I wrote an essay called "Letting Go of Socialism," where I was talking about the same things I'm talking about today. About it's necessary for people to let go of socialism if we're going to achieve freedom. And one of the programs I pointed out was vouchers. It's just another socialist program. It's based on forcibly taking money from one group of people and funding the education of another group of people. I said, really, what you need to do is separate school and state, just like our ancestors separated church and state. And this is 30 years ago. And Friedman actually was reading our material, and he gave a speech criticizing me, saying, okay. Well, he complimented the Future of Freedom Foundation, and he said, hey, they're doing good work. But he says, the way to get to what Jacob's talking about is through vouchers. Well, it isn't through vouchers. Vouchers only make the state more deeply involved in the educational system. It makes private schools dependent on them. They start expanding operations. They've got an influx of students. They go out and borrow money to build new school buildings. They hire school teachers. And all of a sudden, they've got this huge apparatus that's dependent on the vouchers. What are the chances that they're going to say, well, okay, let's end our program here? It's just not going to happen. Otherwise, who's going to pay back the loan? What are they going to do with those empty buildings again, and so forth? And then, of course, whoever takes the vouchers is now subject to government control. What happens today is libertarians who advocate vouchers actually do so, if you can believe this, not as Milton Friedman said, as a way to get rid of public government schooling, but as a way to improve the socialist system, the public schooling system. That's their justification now. There's one great big but that, is essentially become permanent among voucher proponents. And it's very interesting for me to watch voucher proponents today that are about my age that have been advocating school vouchers for, the 31 years that I've been here at the Future of Freedom Foundation, because they're still doing it. And they haven't gotten at the point saying, well, it's been gradual, but now's the time to get rid of it. It's instead they're saying we need to expand it. So here you've got another but. I favor freedom, but Jacob, we've got to have public government schooling or a voucher program and so forth. So you've got this massive sea of buts that people have sunk into, really. You got, I favor freedom, but Social Security, but Medicare, but Medicaid, there's for disease control, but education, but immigration controls, and on and on. If you take like the drug war, so most libertarians, they criticize the drug war, but there's lots of libertarians that want to just legalize marijuana and reform the rest of the drug war, like get rid of mandatory minimum sentences or get rid of asset forfeiture. But they want to continue making it illegal to take the hard drugs, heroin, cocaine, opioids. They say, oh, these are so addictive and so dangerous. So it's, Jacob, I favor freedom, but we've got to have drug laws against these addictive drugs. There's just no other way, because they'll destroy people. You see, they can't process this moral imperative and liberty that people have a right to ingest whatever they want to ingest, no matter how dangerous it is, no matter how harmful it is. Now, that's not to suggest that anybody is saying that this is a good thing, any more than a lot of other conduct that should be free of criminal prosecution is a good thing. But what we're saying is that people have to go in that direction. And oftentimes when people go off in that bad direction, that's when they find themselves. And they pull themselves out of the hole and through therapy or rehab or whatever, and they're a much better person for it. Otherwise, they find themselves in a penitentiary and probably learn the drug trade even better there, and they come out and usually do the same thing. But the point again is with respect to freedom. You've got another but here. I favor freedom, Jacob, but you've got to have drug laws for these hardcore drugs. So there's another but. I favor freedom, but Jacob, we've got to have that embargo against Cuba. I mean, there's just no question about it. And we got to have sanctions against Iran. I mean, what would we do if we couldn't punish these people for being communists or for being independent of the U.S. government or for criticizing the CIA's coup in Iran in 1953? No, Jacob, we've got to be able to punish communists or people living in communist countries. How are we going to get regime change there? And so you end up with another great big but. And of course, with this but, the embargo is actually an infringement on the economic liberty of the American people. I mean, if you travel to Cuba today and you spend money there without the official permission of the U.S. government, on your return, they will arrest you. They will prosecute you. They will put you into an American jail for doing those things. Traveling where you're not supposed to and spending money where you're not supposed to. I mean, how is that reconcilable with freedom? Well, it's not. It's obviously denigration of freedom, a violation of freedom. See, the thing that's important to keep in mind with respect to libertarianism is the non-aggression principle. That's the core principle of our philosophy. It says that we won't initiate force and we won't support the initiation of force or fraud against another human being. But that's what these embargoes and sanctions, that's what all these programs do. They initiate force against peaceful, law-abiding people. And so even if you talk about the gradualism where people say, well, Jacob, I favor freedom, but I want to gradually get rid of these programs that are violating the libertarian non-aggression principle, notice that during the period of the gradualism, whatever that may be, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, I know with Social Security, they're talking about gradually getting rid of it over like a 40-year period of time. During that entire 30, 40 years, they're violating the libertarian non-aggression principle. And that applies to any of their reform methods for Social Security, by the way. A popular one is the Social Security privatization, which is really just a fascist type of Social Security system, where the people are forced to invest their money in government-approved retirement accounts in the stock market. And the person who adopted that kind of system was General Augusto Pinochet in Chile. He was the military dictator, brutal guy that the U.S. installed into power down there through a coup where they ousted their democratically elected president, Salvador Allende, who had the type of Social Security system that America has today. But the advocates of privatization say, oh, no, let's go with this system, And it was the same. It's the same system that Pinochet had, but it's a fascist system. And then what happens if the stock market plummets all of a sudden? Then what happens? Then all of a sudden people are going to say, oh, see, libertarianism failed. But it's not libertarianism. It's a but. It's I favor freedom, Jacob, but we've got to have something that forces people to take care of their own retirement. Well, that's not freedom. Jacob, I favor freedom, but we've got to have the CIA, Jacob. I mean, how would we survive if the CIA didn't have this power of assassination and the power of coups and regime change operations? How would we be able to change the regime in Cuba? How would we be able to change the regime in Iraq and Afghanistan and Iran and North Korea and China and Russia? No, Jacob. Freedom means having omnipotent government, the government that can assassinate people with impunity, or kidnap people, or torture people. Well, you see, there's another great big but there. I mean, how can you have a free society when you live under omnipotent government? Even if it's only a portion of the government that's exercising the omnipotent powers. It really doesn't matter that you can have 95% of the government operating as a limited government, but as long as you got the 5 that's able to do the assassinating, the torturing, the kidnapping, and the executing extrajudicially, what does it matter that the other is operating under limited principles? Or I favor freedom, Jacob, but we need a massive military establishment, the military-industrial complex, the Pentagon, all these foreign military bases and domestic military bases. Oh, no, Jacob. Let's not go too far. How would we be kept safe and secure without a massive standing army? Well, a massive standing army is your greatest threat to freedom. I mean, the founding fathers understood that. That's why they established a limited government republic. and they never would have gone along with a national security state like we have today. If the Constitution had presented them with a national security state, there's no chance that they would have approved the deal. They would have continued operating under the Articles of Confederation, in which the federal government didn't even have the power to tax. That's how weak its powers were. So, in order to achieve freedom, you need a governmental apparatus that is consistent with freedom. And that governmental apparatus is a limited government republic, which has just a small, relatively small, basic military force, not the massive standing army, military-industrial complex, empire of military bases that we have today. And then I favor freedom, Jacob, but we've got to have the NSA up there surveilling people. I mean, how would we be free, Jacob, if they didn't keep track of everybody's website visits and phone calls and emails and so forth? Well, you see, there's another but. And so when you add up all these buts on the welfare state side, the regulated side, the military side, the intelligence side, we've sunk in a sea of buts. And unfortunately, a lot of these buts, now we know mainstream America loves the buts. I mean, it's a nation of Butinskis, really. I mean, you can easily say that. But what's sad is that the libertarian movement has sunk in this sea of buts. Because if you did a survey of the libertarian movement, I don't have any doubts that the great majority of them, the dominant sentiment in this movement, is of buts. That everyone has at least one but. And as Leonard Read points out in this essay, once you have your favorite but, you've lost the moral argument. You've lost the moral high ground. I mean, once you become a defender of Social Security and Medicare, how can you really legitimately criticize somebody on the left for defending public housing and food stamps? I mean, that's their favorite but. So if you have a favorite but, how come everybody else doesn't have a favorite but? And so you've lost the moral high ground. Any libertarian who takes a position that I favor freedom, but we've got to have Social Security, or we've got to have public schooling, we've got to have Medicare, Medicaid, Centers for Disease Control, that person has lost the moral ability to challenge the entire welfare state way of life in America, which is really the greatest infringement in a macro sense on the freedom of the American people. That's what's really depriving us from being free. But then again, there's the national security state side, which is really an even greater infringement than the welfare state side, much more dangerous and much more precarious. That's where we've lost so much of our freedom to the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA, and to a certain extent the FBI, which President Truman called a Gestapo force. But there's another one. There's another but. If you did a survey of libertarians, Jacob, I favor freedom, but we've got to have an FBI, Jacob. I mean, who would handle the kidnappings in America if the FBI wasn't here? And who would handle the terrorism and all this other stuff? And so there's another but. So you've got America who has sunk into a sea of buts, but sadly you've got the libertarian movement, but it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, that's why I'm recommending every libertarian to read or reread Leonard Read's piece and digest it and reflect on it. Let's get rid of these buts. Let's get rid of all of them. Let's have the libertarian brand be of liberty. And that was the original concept of libertarianism. Genuine liberty, no buts at all. This is what Read's talking about. That as soon as you let in the buts, you're not talking about liberty anymore. That liberty involves getting rid of all of these buts, getting rid of all of the infringements on liberty. The IRS, the income tax, the Federal Reserve, there's another one. I favor freedom, Jacob, but we've got to have a Federal Reserve, Jacob. I mean, how would the government manage the money supply if we didn't have a Federal Reserve? It would be just chaos, Jacob, without the Federal Reserve. See, so there's another but. Or even just having government involved in money. Jacob, I favor freedom and free markets, but you've got to have government, providing the money. And otherwise, there'd be chaos and monetary chaos and so forth. And of course, that's what we've had ever since the Fed came into existence, ever since they turned to a paper money standard, a fiat money standard in the 1930s. It's just been monetary chaos. That's what socialism is, and that's what it does. It's done it in everywhere: healthcare, education, retirement, the military. I mean, look at all these central planning of these invasions trying to centrally plan things in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and Libya, and Vietnam, and Korea. I mean, it's just been an absolute disaster. And so if we're going to achieve freedom, and I think we've got a real chance to achieve freedom, I think it's important that we libertarians do some soul searching, that we go back and we reread things like Sinking in a Sea of Butts by Leonard Read, and we reflect on these principles that Read was talking about and ask ourselves, is it really necessary to advocate these butts? Do we really have to be a movement of Butinskis, of advocates of butts? I don't think so. I think we can all be advocates of liberty. And after reflecting and digesting and discussing this thing, just get rid of one butt and another butt and another butt and another butt until we get rid of all the butts and we just stand for liberty. And then that way our libertarian brand becomes highlighted. People start focusing on it. They start understanding the principles behind it. Because as soon as you start advocating the butts, people can't understand the principles anymore. Because you're sinking in a sea of butts, as Reed said. So let's get out of this sea and let's just reestablish our brand, our libertarian brand. Let's get rid of the butts. Let's stand for liberty. Let's make the case for liberty. And that's this week's Libertarian Angle. Thank you for tuning in. Again, come and visit us at fff.org. Subscribe to FFF Daily, to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. We're going to have a great civil liberties conference that we're putting together for the fall. And you can be apprised of that by subscribing to FFF Daily. And, of course, subscribe to this YouTube channel if you're not already subscribed. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'll talk to you all next week.